Imagine a superhero so powerful, so dangerously unstoppable, that the only way to save the world was to erase him from everyone's memory. Not by accident, not by tragedy, but intentionally, because remembering him meant inviting disaster. Hey everyone, welcome back to Panelix. Today we're uncovering the truth behind the hero Marvel intentionally tried to forget, which brings us straight into the heart of Sentry 2000. This series reveals something shocking. The Sentry wasn't just another superhero. He was written into the very fabric of major events alongside iconic characters across the Marvel Comics universe. But all those connections, all those battles, all those friendships were wiped clean. The world forgot him, the heroes forgot him, and even the history of Marvel itself was rewritten to hide his existence. And here's the terrifying part. Sentry didn't just lose his place in history, he was forced to forget who he really was. Because if those memories came back, so would an ancient darkness tied directly to him, a threat powerful enough to destroy everything. So now, let's peel back the erased pages of Marvel's history and rediscover the hero they tried to bury. This is the full storyline of Sentry 2000. Let's begin. At that time, the night seemed so restless. The wind blew strongly, and occasionally, lightning flashed near a house. Inside, a married couple slept soundly with their 2 pets. The atmosphere was so peaceful that it felt as if the world had stopped spinning to give them a moment of tranquility. However, that tranquility did not last long when a dog sleeping on the side of the bed suddenly opened its eyes. It sensed the presence of something unfamiliar that was invisible, but clearly carried an evil aura. Its natural instincts told it that something was lurking in the distance, slowly but surely approaching. A few seconds later, the bedroom window opened by itself. No hand touched it. There was no logical reason why the latch could have come loose. A cold wind blew in, carrying dry leaves that swirled in the air. At the same time, a mysterious laugh echoed, eerie enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Of all the occupants of the house, only Bob heard it. He woke up immediately, gasping for breath, his body covered in a cold sweat, as if he had just been startled by a nightmare that was too real. Then he heard a soft whisper inside his head saying, "He's back." His wife also woke up, startled by Bob's scream. Calmly, she asked Bob what had happened to him, but Bob did not answer. His lips trembled, but no words came out. The whisper in his head reiterated a warning and an order for Bob to remain silent and not tell his wife. Bob just stared at the open window, realizing that the peace of the night had just ended. Bob immediately carried out the mysterious whisper's command and told Lindy to go back to sleep while he took the dog outside. Bob also said that it was just the sound of a storm and he would handle it as the mysterious whisper had instructed. As Bob walked down the stairs, the mysterious whisper continued, saying that Bob was not imagining things and that he had not heard that laughter in a long time. It explained that it had probably been months or years since Bob had heard that voice because everything now felt so distant, as if Bob had just awakened from an eternal dream. Bob told the dog to stay calm while he went to find out what had actually happened to him and where he had been all this time. Bob took an old book from the shelf, trying to remember how he had arrived at that house, as if rewatching his life through someone else's eyes. He saw the vast emptiness that stretched out that night while remembering the evil laughter he would never forget. The mysterious whisper said that the void, which had been hiding behind the storm, was beginning to crawl back to Earth. Bob opened the middle page of the book and found a hidden compartment containing a small bottle of liquor, not as an escape, but as a symbol of the pressure he had been carrying. The whisper returned, more assertive, more urgent, saying that the void was rising again and that humanity's only hope was him. Bob remembered a character from a comic he had read, a hero named Sentry, a figure with extraordinary powers described as having energy equivalent to the explosion of 1,000,000 suns. In the story, Sentry was none other than himself. He remembered how it all began when he accidentally discovered the professor's secret formula. The formula changed his life forever and made him the Golden Guardian of Good. Bob stared at the bottle he found in the old book. A thought crossed his mind that the bottle resembled the secret formula described in the comic. He lifted it slowly, as if reconsidering the burden and responsibility he might have to bear. Then he looked at his loyal dog, who had been alert since that night, and said, "We must be vigilant, Watchdog, for we're humanity's only hope." In the story, the secret formula gave Bob powers that could not be explained scientifically. His body radiated a bright energy that flowed like the light of life, making his movements much faster than any human. With that power, he had once stopped an attack in a matter of seconds. In his youth, this made many people, including women, admire his charismatic and courageous figure. However, for Bob now, that power was not something to be admired, but something to be held accountable for. To strengthen his identity, Bob then sewed his own gold costume that he designed. Although the costume is no longer his identity, a mysterious voice in Bob's head tells him that he must use it again if the Void truly returns, and he transforms into the Sentry. Calmly, Bob then opened the bottle and drank it while feeling effects he hadn't felt in years. A smile began to appear on Bob's face as the liquid wet his throat, giving him a sensation like a million suns exploding, spreading throughout his body and bringing back all the sweet memories he had left behind. Suddenly, Bob remembered a photo that he used to be very proud of because it was a reflection of himself as a hero who had kept 6 billion humans safe for years. Together with his beloved dog, Watchdog, Sentry remained vigilant in protecting humanity because they were the only hope. However, all of that was nonsense from a comic book Bob had read as a child. Nevertheless, the mysterious whisper explained that the threat of the Void was real because Bob knew it as well as he knew himself. Bob then tried hard to remember what had happened to him, but all he could recall was the comic book that told the story of the Avengers' struggle to defeat the Void. The comic explained that Iron Man's costume was no match for the cosmic power of the Void, making Sentry the only natural counter to the Void. With a power equivalent to the explosion of 1,000,000 suns, Sentry could easily defeat the Void, even though it would return again and again. The mysterious whisper reinforced the Void's statement that it would always keep its word and return. Bob then goes outside to calm himself from the danger ahead, but he cannot understand the threat. In the silence of the night, Bob questions himself about who he really is. Back to the comic storyline. Sentry is now depicted as having entered adulthood, much more mature, and understanding of the responsibilities he bears. He goes to the professor, the only person who truly understands his power, to ask for a new serum that can push his physical abilities to the next level. According to the professor, the serum can cause the molecules in Bob's body to shift phases, as if each atom were moving slightly faster than the flow of time. In addition, the serum also triggers a photosynthesis-like reaction in his body, opening up a level of consciousness that is broader and sharper than that of any human being. In that state, Sentry essentially becomes a figure whose power is almost limitless. He is able to transcend the boundaries of space and time, making him an almost immortal, omnipotent figure in the sense that he is no longer completely bound by the laws of nature. To Bob, it all sounds like a dream and an unimaginable burden. However, behind his greatness, there were inevitable consequences. The professor warned that the serum carried a great risk. Sentry would become increasingly dependent on it, and each increase in power would require a higher dose along with increased danger. Even so, Sentry remained steadfast. He refused to think about the risks because only one thing mattered to him: saving the galaxy, whatever the cost. A mysterious voice in Bob's mind confirmed that he had no choice, even though he was dependent on the serum. Sentry would always be the last line of defense against the Void, even though he would never win and the Void would always return. Suddenly, a flash of Bob's memory about the Void appeared, saying, "Black and black and black again. I am the face of your soul." Bob looks confused, but the mysterious voice in his mind tells him that he can fix it. The Confluctor is the only artifact still functioning in the Temporalon's homeworld after the Void attacked, and Bob can use it to defeat the Void. To do so, he must repair it before the Void returns completely, as the device can at least confuse it for a while. Bob began repairing the Confluctor again, even though he was not as brilliant as he used to be. However, the serum began to take effect, disturbing Bob after years of not feeling its effects. This drove Bob a little crazy. His body began to turn pale and his eyes turned red. Bob repeated the slogan from the Sentry comic, "We must be vigilant." But suddenly, a voice answered Bob's words. Bob looked very shocked when he saw his dog possessed by the void and starting to turn into a monster. He began to scream in fear while firing a beam of light characteristic of Sentry's power, thinking that it wasn't real. The dog's body faded away due to the beam of light, but it still threatened Bob, saying, "Pathetic, dirty little junkie. Did you really think you could send me away forever? And what then? No more Sentry to soothe humanity's fevered brow?" Bob immediately looked away, trying to calm himself as he said with a trembling voice that Sentry was gone, and so was the void. However, the mysterious voice coming from the dog rejected this statement, saying that everything Bob believed was a lie. The void was not an alien creature, but the dark side within Bob himself. The voice even claimed that his house and wife were part of the void because Bob was essentially the void. Those words pierced Bob's mind, triggering the fear he had been hiding all this time. He tried to convince himself that it was all just his imagination running wild. Fear turned to panic, then panic turned to a spontaneous reaction as Bob screamed and did something he didn't really want to do. Bob's scream echoed and woke Lindy. With an annoyed expression, she ran to her husband and found Bob curled up on the floor, trembling with fear, while their dog lay weakly after being kicked. Lindy looked at Bob with disappointment because she couldn't believe what had just happened. Bob tried to explain that it wasn't their dog but the void returning. However, Bob's argument was refuted because Lindy saw the bottle that Bob had previously drunk from and believed it to be liquor that Bob had been secretly storing. Lindy felt very sad to see her husband's betrayal, even though he had promised not to drink liquor anymore. Lindy, who could no longer bear to see Bob's actions, said that Bob needed to get help immediately, because he had previously promised to go to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, a recovery center for alcoholics. Meanwhile, she would go to Judy's house for a few days, taking their pets with her and leaving Bob alone there. However, a voice in Bob's head told him to let Lindy go because it was better that way, considering that Lindy would not understand his situation. Bob agreed, which made Lindy even more disappointed because Bob did not give her any explanation, let alone stop her. Although it was very difficult for Bob, the voice was right because it would be safer if Lindy did not remember who Bob was at all. No one remembered him except Bob himself. The voice inside Bob told him that he used to be a hero who had a life and adventures as challenging as a roller coaster. Bob stood among the superheroes, fighting evil, and persevered until the evil was gone. But the end of every journey was always the beginning of another. Bob should have known that the day would come when he would wear the Sentry suit again. It felt completely different when Bob put on his old costume for the first time after years of staying away from his old life. The gold and blue fabric clung to his body like memories that had suddenly found their way home. Meanwhile, he saw the night sky adorned with a familiar light, the Sentry signal, crossing the dark sky like a call from the world he had been trying to leave behind. The light confirmed one thing, that people had never forgotten him. They still had hope in the figure who had once sworn to protect them. Bob took a deep breath, then slowly opened the door. The night air hit his face, bringing a coolness that felt like an invitation to a new chapter in his life. Now, Sentry, the golden guardian of good, stood up again. He stepped outside, walked through the quiet yard before slowly walking into the middle of the street, lit by city lights. While straightening his cloak, he looked up at the waiting sky. In that silence, he lifted his body and soared into the air, flying into the vastness of the night, ready to face whatever awaited him. That morning, the New York sky was clear, creating a peaceful atmosphere that should have calmed anyone. But for Bob, that calm was merely a backdrop for the chaos in his mind. He was still haunted by fragments of his past, scattered like pieces of a puzzle that had lost their original shape. A faint whisper continued to appear in the corner of his mind, reminding him that he was not a hero, but just Bob Reynolds, an ordinary citizen with a life he had lived before everything changed. Even so, the whisper confirmed that he had once been Sentry, a figure so great that it was hard to believe the world could just forget him. What made it all even stranger was that the Whispers knew small details about him, from his weight, his habit of watching cartoons instead of the news, to his tendency to rely on alcohol. The Whispers were too accurate, as if they came from the deepest part of himself that he was trying to reject. These thoughts continued to overwhelm him until he began to talk to himself, looking like a man who had lost control. Unconsciously, he stood with one foot on a tall crane being used for the renovation of Freedom's Plaza, as if his inner instability was pushing him to a dangerous physical limit. Ironically, Bob used to be an ordinary person who broke out in a cold sweat in crowds, afraid of flying and even heights. But strangely, he now went through all of that as if it were normal without knowing the cause. Bob felt a strange vibration from the past, as if he knew why he was there but couldn't explain the reason behind his actions, which he believed to be something monumental. In the comic Sentry, The Armageddon Gambit, Part 4, it is told that the Void has returned, enveloping the entire city in pitch-black emptiness. But Sentry arrived too late, so we had to watch his sidekick, Billy, being attacked by the Void. Without hesitation, Sentry unleashed a huge explosion that echoed with the screams of millions of people, leaving Manhattan as a black hole. In the midst of his confusion, Mr. Fantastic, also known as Reed Richards, approached him, looking at him with curiosity about his identity and his presence at such a high altitude. Bob greeted Reed and asked him how many buildings had recently been built there. This confused Reed but piqued his interest. However, what really intrigued Reed was how this stranger had managed to climb up to an area with such tight security and stasis fields around it without becoming paralyzed. Bob didn't want to answer the question because he knew Reed wouldn't believe him. And sure enough, Reed thought Bob was crazy. Reed continued to try to satisfy his curiosity by asking the same question, and Bob replied that he got there the same way. Bob admitted that he had been there many times before, but Reed would not be able to remember it. And strangely, Bob still did not know how to explain it. Bob was convinced that the world had systematically forgotten him, as if some great power had erased every trace of him from human memory. He felt that there was something about him that had once made him an important person, but now no one recognized him, as if there was a conspiracy behind it. For this reason, Bob asked Reed to try to remember one thing about him that was related to a wedding, because Bob knew that something monumental was about to happen, and he needed Reed's help to deal with it. However, Reed did not understand at all and instead thought that Bob was someone who had broken into his security system. He praised Bob's skills but not his common sense, and for that Bob would be punished for trespassing. Bob completely ignored Reed's words and suddenly mentioned unicorn, which further confused the elastic man. Reed pondered for a moment, trying to figure out what Bob meant. But without realizing it, the mysterious man had disappeared without a trace. Anxiety began to grow within the scientist, who began to sense something unusual about the meeting. Meanwhile, at the Baxter building, Ben aka The Thing and Johnny aka Human Torch were watching a television program about the strange phenomena occurring around the world. A Turkish woman claimed that she saw a violent storm cloud sweeping through her village at night. The woman said it was the devil who came from the sky. The biggest mystery was how 400 people could disappear without a trace, raising the question of whether there was a great evil force behind it all. Meanwhile, a mysterious black mass was seen floating above the skies of London. However, Ben, who was with Johnny at the time, was not at all interested in watching the news, even though it hinted that something was wrong. They felt that the news they saw on TV was increasingly absurd, considering that Captain Kirk's latest mission was to turn Americans' brains into jelly. Upon arriving at the Baxter building, Sue, also known as the Invisible Woman, saw the confusion on her husband's face and felt that something was wrong with him. Reed asked Sue if they had ever been to a wedding before, and Sue replied that they had been to many weddings, but that was not what Reed meant. He then asked if they had ever been to a wedding where there was a unicorn, and immediately, Reed saw a unicorn statue clearly displayed there. On the other hand, Bob, who was overwhelmed with confusion and exhaustion, was seen riding a train. His body felt heavy due to the chaos filling his head, causing him to fall asleep to the rhythm of the train. In his sleep, Bob saw a beautiful memory of his wedding to Lindy, which was mentioned in Stanley's comic, The Wedding of the Sentry. In his memory, a young Bob came to see Lindy to tell her something. Although he was very nervous at the time, Bob remained determined to tell the woman he loved who he really was. Bob then revealed that he was the Sentry, and it turned out that Lindy already knew this. The Sentry was confused because Lindy had known all along. Overjoyed, he hugged his beloved and gave her a sweet kiss that would last forever. Back at the Baxter Building. This time, Reed was very surprised when he saw the unicorn statue that had been standing there all this time, and had not noticed it at all. Like Reed, Sue was also surprised because she did not know how long the statue had been there. They then observed the statue more closely, where Sue felt something strange like déjà vu, and Reed felt the same thing, which made him curious about the mystery behind it. One day at Bob's wedding, Reed and other superheroes also attended. Not as a regular guest, Reed came to be Bob's best man because he was one of his best friends. That's why Reed was the first person Bob went to after he regained his memory. At the event, Reed gave a speech to the guests while roasting the bride and groom. After that, he asked Ben to make sure Tony Stark, also known as Iron Man, got home safely. Ben agreed to Reed's request on the condition that he owed him $10. Seeing Reed alone, Bob came over to talk to him. He looked very happy, but also surprised to see such a diverse group of guests. Reed explained that they respected Bob for what he had done all this time as Sentry. As a token of gratitude, Bob gave Reed a unicorn statue. He was touched by Bob's gift because he thought it was very beautiful, and Reed likened the unicorn statue to Sentry, the invisible guardian who could only be seen by those who were pure and worthy. Bob explained that he couldn't just thank his best man for accompanying him, so he gave him the unicorn. Reed said that Sue would definitely love it, and that for the first time in his life, Reed was speechless. Bob then left with Lindy, saying, "Let's just say it's in case we ever get too busy and lose touch. You know, something to remember by." Reed just stood there watching the couple leave while looking at the unicorn statue. At the same time, Bob, who had been asleep, woke up and remembered who Reed was to him. A voice inside him said that Reed was his good friend, as was Sue, who had once styled her hair with Lindy. They were Bob's allies and people he trusted deeply. But now, none of that mattered, because they had forgotten Bob. So Bob had to find a way to make them all remember him. Meanwhile, Reed and Sue find a cassette tape under the unicorn statue. Sue feels a little creeped out because she feels like she has forgotten a secret that was once told to her. They feel something strange but don't know why. To answer this, Reed quickly plays the tape so they don't sink into confusion. At the same time, Bob is still haunted by his past as Sentry. A voice in Bob's head now confirms that he is a hero, and that his greatest enemy, the Void, has returned to Earth. No one knows where it came from or why, but it is real, and has come on the night wind to take human souls. Bob wanted to tell everyone that he was a hero, but people would never believe him. The voice in Bob's head said, "Even though they don't realize it, they're giving you a wide berth. Maybe it's because you look like hell. Or maybe it's because now that you're beginning to remember, you're no longer casting a shadow." Hearing this, Bob's confidence crumbled. He looked down, gazing at the people around him with inferiority, feeling increasingly isolated even though he was in the middle of a crowd. On the other hand, Reed and Sue, who were still curious about the contents of the tape, asked Ben and Johnny for permission to watch it on their TV. At the same time, Bob was seen leaving the train listlessly, while being glanced at cynically by the other passengers. He walked toward uncertainty, while the Fantastic Four were about to find the answer to the puzzle he left behind. When Reed finally plays the tape, a recording they never expected appears on the screen. It turns out that the person in the video is himself saying, "Hello, Reed. If all goes well, you'll never find yourself watching this videotape. But if you've somehow found the tape and you are watching this message, then we're all as good as dead." After previously meeting Mr. Fantastic, it seems that it has not yielded any results because Bob had to leave with empty hopes. Now Bob heads to a large tree to meet his old friend Hulk, who looks gloomy at the time. Hulk realizes that someone is behind him, but he doesn't know who it is. Hulk firmly asks the person to leave, but Bob doesn't care at all and instead says, "It's me, Bruce." Hulk immediately became very angry and seemed about to tear the man who approached him to pieces. However, There was something strange about their encounter because Hulk clearly remembered that the man in front of him was Golden Man, also known as Sentry. Meanwhile, at the Baxter Building, the Fantastic Four were very focused on listening to the contents of the mysterious recording they had found earlier. Reed, who was from the past, tried to convince his future self even though he knew it felt strange and confusing. He knew that someone named Bob Reynolds had recently come and claimed to be someone known as Sentry, and for that reason, he asked his future self to believe it. Sue asks her husband if it's true, and Reed replies that he did indeed meet someone on the scaffolding of the Four Freedoms Plaza construction site. However, Reed feels that he has never met this man in his life, even though the man he met acted as if he knew him. Reed from the past explained that the Void had returned with far greater consequences, causing the mysterious man he met to regain his memory. For that reason, he asked his future self to listen carefully to what he had to do. However, the tape suddenly malfunctioned, so they only heard his real name, Bob. This confuses them all because the situation is getting more interesting, and in the midst of the confusion, the tape explodes like a bomb before Johnny can fix it. The three of them look at Johnny angrily as if it were his fault, while Johnny innocently turns around and says, "Hey, don't look at me." On the other hand, Bob, who was with Hulk, felt that something was wrong with Bruce because he should have evolved at that moment. With a sad look, Hulk said that Hulk was not Bruce because Hulk was Hulk, but he was also confused and asked Bob if Hulk was Bruce. Bob casually answered yes, making Hulk realize that Hulk was Bruce Banner, but he couldn't quite remember it. Bob smiled as he held Hulk's shoulder and said that he was thinking well. Bob felt a little relieved even though the only one who remembered who he really was Hulk. However, Bob was curious if Hulk would still remember him when he turned back into Bruce, and Hulk innocently replied, "Hulk is happy. Golden Man is Hulk's best amigo." Bob explained to Hulk that someone had made the whole world forget his existence, as if the memory of him had been erased like a mass hypnosis effect. He was sure there was a big conspiracy hiding this truth. Bob also felt as if he had made a mistake, but he didn't know how to explain it. To ensure that Hulk remembers him, Bob gives him a small piece of sunlight essence, something very important and connected to his power. This action makes Hulk realize that the Golden Man's return after so long is not normal. Now he begins to question what really happened to Bob and why everything feels so strange. Bob explained that he was sure his old enemy, the Void, had returned, but he didn't know how to explain it. However, Bob sensed these signs through the cold air around him as a sign that the Void was hiding in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to come out. Hulk panicked a little after hearing that the Shadow Man he knew was coming back. Bob knew that Hulk was afraid because he felt the same way, but for now, they couldn't do anything because the Void hadn't shown itself yet. Therefore, Bob asked Hulk to help him. Hulk replied firmly, "Always for Golden Man, Hulk will be the bravest there is." Before leaving, Bob said he couldn't lie to Hulk and warned him that the danger they would face was worse than before. Meanwhile, a minister was seen visiting an ethnic group that was affected by a disaster in Africa. The captain explained that they would be entering dangerous territory, but the minister did not care because it was his duty. He knew that the people of this tribal group were simple and honest individuals who still maintained their ancient traditions. He hoped that his arrival would reassure the tribal people so that they would re-elect him in the future. Seeing that the minister did not believe the situation he described, the captain gave him a mask because the area they were going to visit had been quarantined. The minister reluctantly wore the mask even though he felt that the captain was exaggerating. However, when he saw the situation there, the minister was very shocked because the tribal group had been wiped out along with an elephant. At the same time, Reed was trying to find out more about the man who had approached him. He used his advanced technology to identify the man, but strangely, Reed discovered that the man with the identity of Robert Reynolds was actually dead. He felt that the more he investigated, the more confusing and frightening the results would be because all logical explanations about Robert Reynolds did not make sense. He tried to guess that Reynolds was just someone in a witness protection program, but that didn't fit at all. Behind all this, Reed began to sense that something big was being hidden, something that didn't fit with the way the world worked. He almost realized that this mystery involved something much deeper than a simple false identity. He opened a room that stored all the secret archives and closed his diary by writing, "For the first time since I was a child, I'm feeling an irrational fear of the dark." After meeting Hulk, Bob decided to meet his other old friend, Web Slinger, aka Spider-Man, at his usual hangout. Bob seemed to enjoy the cold New York City wind that blew, bringing with it the possibility of even greater chaos. When Spider-Man arrives, Bob asks Peter if he has ever felt like he forgot something. This surprises Spider-Man because he didn't expect someone he didn't know to know his name. Bob then reminds Peter that he knows him because he once helped Peter win a Pulitzer Prize. Bob then utters a phrase that he still remembers to this day. "Hey Webhead, you're a real swinger. You ain't so bad yourself, golden boy." Bob said it came from a skit on The Tonight Show when he and Spidey met on top of a building, and they both tried to pretend they weren't gay. Bob remembered that the skit was very funny, while Spider-Man had no idea what he was talking about. Spider-Man pretended not to know who Peter was and said he would look for him and let him know he was being sought. For that, Bob would play his last card so Spider-Man could remember him. Spider-Man thought Bob wanted to kill himself by falling slowly, but he was immediately amazed when he saw him floating in the air. Bob then took a photo of Sentry out of his pocket and admitted that Peter was the one who took the photo. However, Spider-Man admitted that he couldn't see anything because the paper looked blank to him. Bob then brought the photo closer, confusing Spider-Man as to who he really was. Finally, Bob revealed his real name, and Spider-Man recognized him as Sentry. Bob explained that the last time they met was when they took the photo, where Peter worked as a photographer at the Daily Bugle. He explained that Spider-Man had once helped him defeat Void, who was working with Wilson Fisk and had managed to control Sentry's mind. In the end, Spider-Man stopped Fisk before Sentry lost control completely. However, Spider-Man doesn't remember any of this and instead calls Bob crazy. He says that Bob's tricks are cool, but he's seen them before. Spider-Man also thought that Bob was Mysterio's henchman and told him to tell Mysterio to convey something to him directly. Since there was no good reason to stay, Spider-Man decided to leave, but Bob held him back. He told Peter that there was something strange and unusual about their world, such as several issues of Clarion, Time, and Life, magazines having out-of-sequence issue numbers, as if some issues were missing. Bob wants Peter to realize that something is being hidden from the truth, that history has been altered or cut, especially regarding the existence of Sentry, who has been erased from everyone's memory. Back to Mr. Fantastic. This time, Reed was busy looking for important files about Sentry. He then found a document containing the Avengers' battle against the Void in Afghanistan, when suddenly he heard someone say, "Yes, he does exist." It turned out to be the voice of Doctor Strange, who appeared suddenly. Reed realizes that Doctor Strange's arrival is not a coincidence, but that he knows Reed has discovered something. However, Doctor Strange does not want to tell him because he has to convince Reed not to hear the answer. This is ironic because both of them know it is impossible, considering that Reed is too curious and will not stop searching for the answer. Just as Doctor Strange said, Reed asked who this person he felt he knew really was. Doctor Strange replied firmly that Reed didn't want to know, but that he and the whole world would be greeted by a reality they never expected. Doctor Strange said that this was all beyond his control, so he couldn't stop it. Doctor Strange knew that Reed was someone who always pursued knowledge, so it was difficult for him to remain silent and let the puzzle remain unsolved. Therefore, Strange asked Reed firmly whether he was willing to accept the consequences of his question, because only Reed could decide. Reed could choose to continue or stop, leave all the folders behind, and try to forget about them. Reed is even more confused by Strange's words, so he asks what he should actually choose. How the universe will end, Doctor Strange replies with concern. After Doctor Strange informed him that his choice could determine how their universe would end, Reed became even more confused because he didn't know how to answer the question. Doctor Strange warned Reed that if he really revealed the question or the truth that Reed was looking for, then Reed would regret ever asking him. Although Reed was a brilliant man who was always attracted to mysterious things like moths to a flame and was capable of finding answers to anything, Dr. Strange seemed to be hinting that Reed should not need to know this. This certainly contradicted his entire life principle of making knowledge a part of his identity. However, Reed still pondered Strange's statement because he felt a strange feeling when he tried to remember who Sentry was. That feeling came from the depths of his consciousness, indicating that the memory erasure performed in the past was not actually complete. Therefore, Reed asked Dr. Strange, "If you were in my position, Stephen, would you be able to leave it at that?" Strange replied emphatically that he could not, and because Reed was increasingly curious, Dr. Strange then asked his permission to share a small piece of their past that was certainly related to Sentry. While opening this small piece of the past, Strange said, "Behold, this is how it was, and how it yet may be." In this flashback, Reed looked very depressed, saying that they did not know how much time they had left and that this might be their only chance. Reed prayed that whatever they did would work because the future of the entire world depended on it. Strange emphasized how dire the situation was, saying that if they failed, they would trigger a catastrophe that no one could imagine. This shows that the threat they faced, the Void, was something far beyond the power of ordinary enemies. Ben then appeared, telling Reed in a stern tone that the device he had built was ready and stable. Ben emphasizes that if Reed has ever risked his neck for a decision, now is the time. Meanwhile, Sue looks very resigned and hopes that their plan will succeed. In this confusing dilemma, Reed finally decides to carry out his plan, but before that, there is one promise that Dr. Strange must keep. With full awareness, Reed asks Strange to do whatever it takes to make them forget about Sentry, if they ever remember him. That is why the tape they played while finding out about Sentry exploded, because Dr. Strange still held fast to that promise. He destroyed the tape so that they would remain oblivious to Sentry, because that was Reed's own wish. This brings them back to the first riddle asked by Dr. Strange, and the question is whether Reed will carry out his own advice or not. Meanwhile, Professor X is seen training with the mutants at Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. Archangel is seen carrying out the training according to Professor X's instructions, but in the middle of the training session, Professor X's consciousness suddenly disappears because Sentry comes to talk to him. Sentry invites Professor X to talk through his mind and asks if he knows him. Professor X feels that he should know Sentry, but the memory seems to be lost and cannot be clearly captured by his mind. However, Professor X can sense Sentry as a friend. Sentry then asked Professor X to dig deeper into his mind because he was sure Xavier would find erased memories about himself there. After digging deeper, Professor X discovered a dark past hidden within Sentry. He saw a major problem that had been attached to Sentry all this time, something dark and ominous lurking within him. He also found a dark shadow that constantly haunted Sentry when he was awake, and asked if this creature was capable of doing evil. Sentry said he couldn't tell him until Professor X could remember him. However, Professor X's desire to remember Sentry was hindered by a heavy burden that seemed to weigh on his mind and prevented him from remembering Sentry. Meanwhile, Logan and Rogue looked a little worried about Professor X, who had suddenly lost consciousness. Logan sensed something disturbing coming towards Professor X, but he didn't know how to explain it. Sentry himself did not recognize the three mutants at all because they were new members of the X-Men, but he still remembered Angel, who looked a little different. Professor X explained that a lot had changed since he left, and so he asked Sentry where he had been all this time. Sentry had no idea what had happened to him, but one thing Sentry was sure of was that the Void had returned. Professor X immediately understood what Sentry was saying and wondered why the Void had returned to Earth. Sentry couldn't answer because he still hadn't regained his full memory. He explained that someone had erased his existence, so he asked everyone to remember him, because that might be their only defense. Seeing that Professor X was still unconscious, Nightcrawler came to check on him, and the professor immediately woke up. He asked them to end the training session because they had important preparations to make. Meanwhile, in Europe, the SHE team, also known as the Superheroes of Europe, experienced a terrible incident. Red Dragon was visibly panicked as he reported to Team 4 that their headquarters was being attacked by something that came out of the darkness, and no one knew what it was. He also reported that other members such as Javelin, Shamrock, and Flying Carpet were gone at that moment. Red Dragon asked Team 4 to send help immediately, but unfortunately, he also had to follow the others. Seeing these unnatural deaths, Magma looked very confused about what had happened to Red Dragon, while Amazon said that they had received many problems there, so they seemed to have to ask for help from America to solve them. In addition, their other members, such as Claymore, Gunner, and Yvette, were also unable to solve the increasing number of problems, so Amazon felt that the situation was out of control. On the other hand, Belgian Brain said that all the data they had collected did not form any pattern, which meant that the incident was too strange to be explained normally. However, Belgian Brain felt that the incident was actually similar to something that had happened before. At the same time, they received another warning of psionic activity, meaning that very strong mental energy or supernatural powers had been detected. Oracle also added that they had received other information about a large black cloud over the skies of Ukraine heading towards Kiev. This further confused Magma because all these strange activities were happening in close succession. Meanwhile, at the Daily Bugle, Peter was still busy solving the puzzle left behind by Sentry. Robbie, who happened to be passing by at the time, looked very surprised at what the young man was doing at such an unusual hour. To solve the puzzle, Peter asked Robbie if he knew why several issues of major magazines such as Clarion appeared to be out of order or missing. Peter said that he had checked the index several times and found that the issue numbers were out of order, jumping from number 742 directly to number 744. Therefore, Peter looked very confused because he couldn't find issue 743, which had disappeared without a trace. Robbie casually replied that there was no issue number 743 because it was not allowed. Apparently, that issue was the one that reviewed the Sentry. Peter immediately thought hard about those words until suddenly his spider sense reminded him of the moment when he photographed Robbie the Sentry. Elsewhere, Tony Stark was seen at a meeting of billionaires and sensed that something was amiss. He immediately asked the others for permission to leave. Sure enough, the Sentry was waiting for him outside. When he saw the Sentry, Tony remembered him immediately and asked where he had been all this time. The Sentry said that he remembered, then asked why he had to accept this consequence. Tony replied that he didn't know, but he had a strange feeling, like the others, that he shouldn't remember the Sentry. The Sentry became angry and was about to hit Tony, saying that he was the hero who saved the world, even before the other heroes appeared or even imagined becoming heroes. He felt like a teacher to many of them, someone who had guided and set an example. Therefore, he couldn't accept the fact that the heroes or people he considered colleagues and students would then do something so terrible to him, such as erasing his existence from the world's memory. Sentry then asked Tony to look at him and explain how his own friends could have done such a thing. At that moment, a memory from the past emerged when Sentry was possessed by the Void and almost endangered everyone in the world. Tony remembered that important superheroes such as Cap, Reed, Strange, and others held a big meeting to discuss this matter. Strange opened the meeting as the representative of the superheroes, saying that they greatly respected Sentry, but with the emergence of this terrible new fact, they felt they had to take immediate action and find out who was responsible. Iron Man firmly rejected the idea, considering that Sentry was a hero who had saved them countless times, even thousands of times. He insisted that they must not forget what Sentry had done, including his success in facing the Hulk and many other major threats. However, Sentry himself calmed Tony down by saying that he had been a hero longer than anyone else, so he knew the difference between right and wrong. Thor also acknowledged Sentry's greatness and service, but he also emphasized that the new truth that had emerged was very difficult to accept. As one of the serum users, Cap also questioned Sentry's dependence on the serum that gave him his powers. According to Cap, he should not continue this dependence, considering the dangerous effects it had. However, Sentry tried to convince the other heroes not to punish him or take drastic measures because he believed they could use the situation to strategically defeat the Void threat, and even hoped that the Void would not return to Earth after their efforts. However, other heroes such as Giant Man remained hesitant because no one really knew what would happen, including Sentry himself, so they had to be careful and vigilant. Reed also emphasized that Sentry must counteract the poison for the sake of humanity's safety, because he had once said that this was a time to be vigilant. To that end, someone said with a heavy heart, "Then it's decided. To all intents and purposes, the Sentry must die." After listening to Tony's memories, Sentry asked the billionaire who had decided to send him away. However, Tony couldn't remember who had said it because all he had were fragments of those memories. Because they had little time left, the Sentry finally reminded Tony that the Void had returned and asked him to make a plea for him so that everyone would understand. After that, the Sentry flew away, leaving Tony with a fear of the Void. On the other hand, the Sentry's former sidekick, Billy, also felt something strange. Suddenly, all the memories he had forgotten about the Sentry came back to him like a nightmare that haunted him. The memory of the Void almost killing Billy woke him up screaming, worrying his mother, who came to check on him. It was clear that he no longer had his left arm and eye, and his chest area had stitches. Billy calmly told his elderly mother that it was just a dream and that he was fine. Back to Sentry, who was still wandering around looking for answers to what had happened to him, the whisper in his head echoed again, making him wonder why everyone had betrayed him and sent him away. Even so, deep down in his heart, Sentry knew that it wasn't that simple. Sentry felt an inner urge that drew him to a certain place, even though he didn't fully understand the reason. The key or answer he was looking for was hidden among the ruins and remnants of human life that filled the streets on the edge of Manhattan, where even ghosts never went that far. As the fog began to lift from his mind, memories of his past and identity began to emerge little by little. And when it all began to unfold, that was when Sentry found his old headquarters known as Watchtower. Sentry's return to Watchtower brought him back together with Clock, the intelligence system that had faithfully accompanied him all this time. Clock greeted its old master with a flat voice that was too formal, like a robot. Sentry asked where it had been all this time, but like everyone else, Clock itself did not know the answer to that question. Clock explained that a virus with the ability to modify itself had been embedded deep within its system. The virus was not merely destructive, but also designed to survive and ensure its existence was known, while at the same time preventing Clock from attempting to delete it. Sentry's attention then turned to a device attached to his body. At first he thought it was part of a new adaptation, but Clock denied it, saying that it was a transmitter. The transmitter could send subliminal messages with extraordinary power strong enough to reach the entire planet and beyond Earth's atmosphere. The Clock explained that its power source came from the serum used by Sentry, but when Sentry demanded an explanation as to why the device was there, the Clock firmly replied that it was forbidden to answer that question. Standing alone in front of the massive Watchtower structure, Sentry felt like a guard who had lost control of his own fortress. He began to understand that Clock was not completely silent because, if observed closely, there was a nuance in the system's response, a sign that it was trying to fight the virus in a subtle way. Sentry acted cautiously by ordering the Clock to set up a containment field around the transmitter and request a thorough analysis before anyone touched it. Questions arose in Sentry's mind as he wondered how long this device had been working silently, erasing all memory of itself from the consciousness of humans and other creatures. Whoever planted the transmitter clearly understood Sentry's system inside and out. This was not random sabotage, but a precisely planned act of betrayal. Sentry then ordered Clock to deactivate the transmitter, but the system flatly refused his request. Sentry asked whose command had forbidden the request, and surprisingly, Clock replied that the prohibition came from himself. Sentry rejected this logic as he felt he had never ordered the command to be cancelled, but Clock continued to warn him. Clock explained that the virus embedded in him would paralyze the entire system if the transmitter was touched, making Clock unsalvageable. Sentry fell silent for a moment, looking up as he realized that not only had his memories been taken, but also his authority over himself. Sentry then asked Clock about the last time it saw him, and Clock replied that the only one present was Sentry. Sentry then pressed Clock for access to the last command before the device was activated, and the shocking truth was finally revealed. Reed Richards was the one who gave the command. The name hung in the air, turning all the confusion into real pain, because now trust had been gambled away in the name of systems and technology. Meanwhile, at Xavier's school, things looked a little worrying when Angel and Storm saw Professor X staring intently at a map of psionic energy. Angel said that Professor X was being very secretive and refused to explain what he was watching. He only said that he was using equipment to measure spikes in psionic activity, but he refused to explain the urgency behind his actions, which raised questions in their minds. And when asked what was happening, Professor X only repeated one message: that they must be patient and remain vigilant. Those words sounded like a vague but real warning. Angel was convinced that behind Professor X's blank stare lay a great fear that he did not want to show them. On the other hand, Sentry found irregularities in the transmitter, which he believed had been made carelessly, as if it had been assembled in a hurry. However, that was precisely its weakness, as its simplicity meant that it contained no hidden traps or additional safeguards, nor any viruses or mechanisms that he could disable in an instant. After examining it carefully, as he deactivated the device, a sense of unease slowly crept into his consciousness. Soon after, something strange happened where his perception seemed to shift, reality shifting slightly from its original place. The change shot out of the Watchtower like a beast finally released from its cage. Energy pierced the sky, spread throughout the city, touched every corner of the world, and suddenly awakened the memories of everyone without exception. On the other hand, Kyle Watson, who was a big fan of Sentry, had rediscovered all his old toys stored in an old chest that had long been forgotten under his bed. At the same time, Kyle realized that the Sentry poster had been clearly displayed in front of him all along, waiting for him to return from his dream. Meanwhile, Billy Turner, also known as Scout, experienced something similar. He found his old blue and gold pajamas lying in the closet, as if waiting all this time to be worn again. But this time, the clothes felt different. They were no longer just pajamas, but something with a deeper meaning. This event occurred all over the world, where people simultaneously breathed a sigh of relief because Sentry had returned. And for one night, humanity could sleep with a slightly safer feeling. However, that relief did not stand alone, because along with the memory of the Sentry, the world also remembered the other side that they had hoped would remain buried. A dark aspect, an entity they would never forget: the Void. No one was spared from that memory. Men and women, dogs and cats, sinners and saints, heroes and villains, all remembered it. Until finally, the memory reached Sentry himself, who remembered everything. Sentry remembered the day when the world believed that Sentry had fallen. His body lay among the rubble, his suit torn and collapsed along with the hopes he had built. That day was remembered as the day of Sentry's fall, and no words could describe the loss of a man of gold. Sentry remembered his funeral, where the world believed he was dead with no chance of return. For everyone, it meant the end of the world's innocence, which also brought the end of a golden age. But behind it all was a plan, a charade that he had to go through. In that charade, Sentry was supposed to pretend to disappear, letting the world believe that he was gone forever. He remembers standing there to witness his own funeral amid public grief, and the heroes who were present paying their respects with an unprecedented salute. Sentry also remembers the last speech delivered by his closest friend in the world, Reed Richards, who said, "The Sentry was a traitor." In front of the heroes, Reed said that Sentry was a fraud, a criminal, and a traitor. There was no defense for this statement, and the heroes' silence became a verdict that Sentry was indeed not one of them. However, behind all these accusations was a lie that Sentry believed had been deliberately planted for him. The Sentry was exiled and brought down by the person he trusted most, Reed Richards, who consciously designed the destruction of his image for the sake of world security. The Sentry then unleashed his long-suppressed anger, asserting that he was the one who had been betrayed, not the other way around. At the same time, Billy, who had remembered everything, chose to leave his mother with great anxiety. He set off in an old car to defend the truth, even though he knew that this choice might cost him his life. The world knew Sentry as a symbol of hope, but Billy knew him as more than that. He left without knowing that he would never really return to his mother because he realized that he had to do it. Meanwhile, Bob returned to his old house to see Lindy, the love of his life. Normie the dog came to greet him, even though Bob had once kicked him hard. At the same time, Lindy appeared, carrying regrets that she had not been able to express for years. With a broken voice, Lindy apologized not for one mistake, but for everything that had happened, and for everything that could not be fixed. Lindy looked at Bob with a face still filled with confusion and guilt. She admitted that all this time she had doubted everything, not because she didn't care, but because her own memory was flawed. Lindy didn't even remember Bob's agoraphobia, which made her feel like a bad woman to Bob. Bob tried to quell the guilt that had already grown by saying that everything was fine, but Lindy still refused to accept that everything could be considered normal. Lindy said that Thor had just come to visit her and considered that to be completely abnormal. Everything about Bob becoming a superhero made Lindy even more stressed because she didn't know what to do and felt unworthy of being a sentry. Bob calmly replied that he still wanted Lindy to be the same as before. Bob assured Lindy that this was only temporary, but there were things he had to take care of first before their lives could return to normal. Bob said that he was labeled a traitor, an accusation that he still didn't understand the origin of. Lindy then tried to recall fragments of a story she had heard accusing Bob of accepting bribes and all sorts of treason that sounded absurd because Bob already had everything. Bob felt that it was all a lie and explained that the person who framed him was the one he trusted the most, Reed Richards. He was set up to fall, made a scapegoat, without ever really understanding why. The most painful thing was not his downfall, but the fact that the betrayal came from the only person he believed would never hurt him. Bob admitted that even now, he didn't know how he could have been so blind. In the middle of the conversation, Normie suddenly barked as if warning that something bad was about to happen. Bob was immediately alert, turning his head and calling Normie to ask what was wrong. The wind suddenly swirled, carrying dust and dry leaves as if something uninvited was approaching. The situation suddenly turned bright red, as if the world itself had been split by something darker than night. A black figure then appeared, not as a human, but as the embodiment of betrayal and anger known as the Void. He pulled Lindy while saying, "You could have trusted me, Sentry. Haven't I always kept my promises?" The Void challenged Sentry to step forward to prove whether the life of the woman he loved truly meant anything. The threat was uttered to attack Sentry's mind, who could do nothing as he tried to attack even though the Void was not yet very strong. The pain on Lindy's face was impossible to hide as she cried, her body tense in the grip that was too strong. She didn't scream, as if her voice had been taken away along with the sense of security she had held onto all this time. The Void laughed at Sentry's reaction, calling him the same as when he was a hero who was too naive, too trusting, with a heart that was easily hurt. He reminded him that his return had been promised long ago, that deep inside Sentry, this shadow had always been waiting for the right moment to reappear. Sentry gasped, his voice cracking as he finally uttered his enemy's name and asked what he really wanted. With a sharp gaze, the Void replied that he wanted everything, more than just the destruction of the world and more than just victory. He wanted to devour all existence, destroy everything called soul, and perhaps start with Lindy. The Void asserted that he would destroy everyone through Sentry. This made Sentry wonder why the Void had returned and brought back his memories, but at that moment, the Void left, ignoring Sentry without a single answer. He dropped Lindy from a height sufficient to kill someone, but Sentry quickly caught her before that happened. With a blank stare, Lindy explains that the Void is trying to tell Sentry something through her, saying, "You know the answer. Look inside." On the other hand, a weather analyst tries to deliver a report in a professional tone, even though there is clearly something strange about the data he sees. A climate disturbance is detected far off the coast of Carolina. The system is forming rapidly, moving abnormally, and rotating counterclockwise. He emphasized that this pattern was not consistent with known natural phenomena. After the broadcast, Sentry appeared and spoke directly to the public in a more controlled manner. He revealed that there was a time when the world's memory of him disappeared and called it the result of a conspiracy. Therefore, he intended to prove the truth and hold those involved accountable. Sentry also felt that the disturbance in the Atlantic was not just a weather anomaly, but a sign of an old threat re-emerging. Bob said that this storm was related to something they had faced before, namely the Void. Sentry warns that the emergence of the Void is the most serious danger, and he is convinced that the Void will appear somewhere on the Upper East Coast, most likely in New York City. For this reason, Sentry asks everyone to remain calm while waiting for the authorities to carry out the evacuation. He also calls on other heroes, not with orders, but with pleas. While acknowledging his old wounds and past mistakes, Sentry stands as a man in need of help. The storm then covers the sky of New York City, accompanied by incessant lightning strikes, making the city feel small in the face of the approaching threat. Amid the chaos, Sentry stands with Hulk as figures who both share the fear of waiting for the arrival of other superheroes. The threat that came was not just physical strength, but a darkness that understood their deepest weaknesses. Hulk stood alert, holding back his fragile courage because he did not want to face that shadow alone. Sentry chose to stay by his side, insisting that this time he did not have to bear that fear alone. From a distance, one by one, figures appear, breaking through the clouds and storms. Heroes arrive from all directions to answer the threat that threatens the world. The city, which previously felt deserted, is now filled with the presence of heroes who take their positions, standing side by side, forming a calm but firm line. In their midst, Sentry stands without excessive grandeur, like a humble leader. Sentry then thanked the heroes who had come. He then sent Storm and Scarlet Witch to guard the coastline towards New Jersey. In the midst of the storm, Scout came to ask for space from his old boss, while Sentry looked quite surprised considering he hadn't seen his sidekick in a very long time. Scout said he was in good condition and asked for serum so he could guard Midtown. Sentry was not too sure about this, but Scout assured him that he had truly returned as a superhero and was no longer chump-pupping burgers. Even so, Scout joked that Sentry was a bad influence according to his mother. Hearing this, Sentry laughed because he was happy to have Scout back. In the middle of the conversation, Sentry suddenly saw a familiar figure approaching him, namely Reed. In front of the Fantastic Four symbol, he accused Reed of betraying him, designing a system that would destroy Sentry's life without his knowledge. Reed denied it and claimed not to remember his actions, swearing that he would never willingly hurt his friend. However, Sentry rejected this empty promise and reminded him that they had once trusted each other with their lives, and now that trust was broken by lost memories. Sentry was seen flying beside the Statue of Liberty, staring at the stormy sky. His inner voice realized that this danger was far greater than anything he had ever experienced. The impending threat was just minutes away from the moment when the superheroes would face the greatest threat ever. The center of the conflict then turned to Sentry himself as deep doubts about his identity arose, questioning whether Sentry was truly a hero or not. And that's the tragic paradox of the Sentry, a hero powerful enough to save the world, yet dangerous enough that the world had to forget he ever existed. It makes you wonder, how many great heroes in fiction, or even in real life, carry a burden so heavy that the world only sees the light but never the shadow behind it? Tell me what you think. Do you believe the Sentry deserved to be erased for the greater good, or was there another way this story could have ended? And which character or storyline should we break down next? Thanks for watching. This is Penelix. Have a nice day.